Seja bem-vindo ao Descomplicar as Finanças Sustentáveis, um podcast organizado em parceria com o Jornal Económico, com o ISEG e com a Embaixada Britânica em Lisboa, ao longo de conversas com nomes relevantes no setor da sustentabilidade financeira, tanto português como britânico. Vamos tentar mostrar qual é o papel do setor financeiro em combater de forma eficaz as alterações climáticas com o apoio de governos e de negócios. O meu nome é João Santos Costa e hoje temos connosco o Nick Bridge, um especialista no clima do Reino Unido, que vai falar connosco sobre esta crescente preocupação em torno das alterações climáticas na sociedade e como estas impactam o clima e o clima de negócios também ele. Welcome right away, Nick Bridge. How are you? I hope you're doing well and thank you for joining us.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
My first question to you, you've been accompanying some COPs before the 26th, which the UK hosted and held the presidency until the beginning of COP27 in Egypt. This last COP had a massive civil society participation, but also unusual participants such as bankers, for instance. What was, in your perception, the biggest change in terms of outsiders in those COPs, and what topics rose because of these new participants and which became less interesting?
Well, thank you. I think it's worth just taking one step back to the COP21, the Paris Agreement 5 years before, because in that historic agreement in Paris, the world basically agreed to do what was needed to avert the climate and ecological catastrophe, but the pledges to do that were very far from sufficient. And the Paris meeting agreed that they would come back, and in 5 years' time there would be a dramatic improvement in pledges, in commitments, practical action. And so, to answer your question, the UK felt it was crucial for at least three things. One was that governments would fundamentally sign up to net zero, and we got from almost no governments, we got more than 90% of the world's governments to agree to net zero, and then they needed to make commitments that were consistent with net zero in 2030. Now, as you say, governments have always been at the table, but secondly, we made this net zero idea just as important to businesses and to the financial system. And these two other areas had not been as focused in the COPs before. So we made it, I suppose, a kind of all of economy question, all of society question. And we invited anybody who wanted to be a leader, if they were in a government or if they were in a business or if they were in a financial system, to join civil society, which was calling for all of this action for so many years, and to take leadership. So I think that was the biggest change at COP26, was it was a more of an all of society effort. And indeed, a whole campaign called the Race to Zero was just as much about businesses and financial institutions as it was about governments, because this is the nature of the problem. It's the global economy is generating these emissions through the way that we run the global economy, and government has to partner, set the framework, but it is reliant on businesses and the financial system to make the shifts as well. So I think that was what we hoped to deliver on in partnership with our civil society in that COP.
Flavia Lima, I'll pass the ball over to you.
Thanks, João. So, Nick, and coming back a bit on what you just said, so there was more civil society, and you said that there was the Race to Zero, which was really important. But during COP26, there was also the day devoted to finance. So you had a different crowd, also as part of the Race to Zero, and it was interesting to see how many people and how many stakeholders were devoted to finance There was one day exclusively to finance. Climate finance is not new in the climate change debates, but Finance Day saw massive commitments and pledges from the private sector and a discussion around green finance. It was interesting to see over 500 institutions responsible for over $100 trillion of private finance assets pledged to net zero targets through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And over 90 asset managers and asset owners already setting concrete decarbonization targets for 2025 and 2030. So what is green finance, and why this became a topic of attention in the past COPs 26 and 27 now?
Yeah, thanks, Flavia. And building on my earlier comments, the pledges by governments don't mean anything if they're not actioned. And so we were very clear that the financial system then had to be serious with us about delivering net zero pathways and delivering increased targets for 2030. Now, we're still not there, but we came a long, long way in that meeting to try and change the weather on this topic and say, that we just don't succeed unless the money starts moving where it needs to move. And the second aspect, looking at it more from the financial system, is there are so many leaders in the financial system who want to do the right thing, who want to shift to clean and sustainable development. And they needed to have a platform to demonstrate that and to say what that meant for them. So it's kind of a win-win, I guess, between government and business finance to build that momentum. And that I think was absolutely crucial for people to be convinced that the government targets mean something. You have to have the sign up from the business sector and the financial system. And so we created that day, and at that day many things happened. Also, you mentioned many of the trillions that were signed up, but again, it was just a first step. Actually, in many cases, we need to see much more detail of what that actually means for stopping investments in emitting sectors and starting investments in other sectors. But secondly, it also encouraged our network globally of finance ministers and central bankers and multilateral development banks to get the signal that the financial system is ready to go if we can just provide the framework. And now the hard work begins. So what are the standards of greening the financial sector? What's the common understanding of the regulatory frameworks that will drive change? Some really difficult decisions here about doing it in a stable way. If you're coming out of fossil fuels in such a dramatic way in such a short time, you have financial stability concerns, as well as stranded asset concerns from staying in those resources. So all of these questions require the real top of the business world, the top of the financial world, and the governors and the finance ministers and the heads of the MDBs and the IFIs to come together. So that was an effort that we generated a real focus around that in the talks. One final comment on it also is we tried to bring nature much more to the front of the COP26 discussions, and that's partly because so many of the solutions to this crisis lie in stewarding nature much better, protecting it, leaving it alone, allowing it to regenerate, restore, stopping deforestation, improving the sustainability of our supply chains, but protecting our oceans. But even more than that, it brings the issue much more to life for ordinary people, pension funds and asset managers, and people who are thinking about where their money is invested. If they can see that we're really directing it at saving the natural world and not just the sort of the emissions, which are sometimes quite hard to envisage. And I think that the combination of bringing a big focus on nature, forests and oceans and species, alongside the chance to do something about it through finance was hopefully also helpful.
And on the back of that, do you think that once the signaling was sent to stakeholders, do you think that they're ready to put their money where their mouth is, in the sense of how they're gonna actually invest on this, and how do they curb greenwashing? Because there's a lot of money, as I said previously, but I don't think we're sure on how the metrics, as you said, the metrics are still being created, how to prevent some sort of greenwashing of happening.
Yeah, this is a huge and very active process now, looking at the standards around the world, and various UK organisations, those that measure emissions, like Carbon Disclosure Project, those that look at responsible investment, the principles for responsible investment. We've got all of these wonderful organisations actually tracking what's happening, and as you say, there's now the whole question of a common understanding of the standard by which people will be judged, and so this work is really difficult because it affects every business decision. I think so. We tackle it in lots of different ways. The task force for looking at climate-related disclosure, that every company, every finance house had to look at what its whole supply chain involved, look at the risks to its business model of what it was doing. Some of that is becoming mandatory. People have to have a fiduciary duty at the top of the organization. Some of it is more voluntary. And so we're right in that moment where the financial system needs massive leadership to give a sense of the urgency of the problem and then make sure that the solutions are coming into play. So the need for every company and every business association to have clarity about what the standards are is happening in various different ways, measuring their own operations, looking at the common standards, the regulations, but they need a signal from regulators and from governments as to how quickly these standards will come in and what kind of standards they are. So that is a very live debate as we speak, and it needs to move very quickly. One of the positive things, I think, is that you don't need even a majority of the market, I think, to move first. If you have visionary leadership in government and in business and in the financial sector, a relatively small number of significant players can move the market and have everybody else follow. So that's one thing we're trying to do, is to work out, not just in finance, but actually in chemicals, in steel, in car making, in industry, in concrete, in every sector of the economy. If you have a leading group who set a new standard and are determined to adhere to it and start making money from it, then you can move the wider marketplace much more quickly. I'll just also give you one final reflection on this topic from business and financial leaders themselves. So at the World Economic Forum, they do a global risk survey each year. And last year, 1,000 CEOs, corporate finance, government, civil society leaders were asked about the top 3 risks to the global economy in the 10 years to come. Number 1, insufficient action to tackle climate change. Number 2, extremes in the climate and in weather, disrupting their operations. Number 3, ecosystem and biodiversity collapse, causing problems with food, water, and energy. And so that's across their entire business model. The top 3 risks are all in this space. So it's a case of getting that understanding, which is now quite widespread, into the operating manual for every business and every financial company fast enough, and having a transition from fossil fuel-based economy to a clean economy in this very, very short window that is manageable, is fast enough, but also doesn't destabilize the entire system.
Do you think that then the question about climate change and its impacts has burst the bubble of COPs and the whole environment that talks about climate change, going to Davos or even G7? Do you think that has managed to burst the bubble and people are actually concerned? You gave a good example of how business are assuming that this will be a major risk to their activity in the future.
Yeah, I think it's the major risk in the long term, and that's acknowledged by everybody. So in that sense, yes. I guess the very worrying thing that we are all conscious of is that we have known for at least 30 years of the scale of all of this, and we've not managed to turn the corner. We still haven't fully peaked and started this dramatic deceleration of emissions. So we're in an extremely alarming situation, and the risks are impossible to overstate. So yes, I think it's widely now understood as never before, but I don't think people have understood how much is already locked in, and therefore how little time we have. So even people dealing with this issue quite a lot can forget that the impacts out there in the world, across Pakistan, across the Horn of Africa, across the floods and fires and the melting, which is happening in some places at an exponential increasing rate, right across every continent of the world. This is happening on the basis of the emissions of 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's all being absorbed in the oceans and in the atmosphere, and it's all still to come out. And so there is the problem of, I guess, as being an incredibly adaptive and reactive human species. And if we just adapt and react, it's not enough. We have to have foresight, wisdom, long-term thinking to understand that actually, if we wait to see the impact and then respond, that's far, far, far too late. So yes, I think it's coming mainstream, but no, it's not resulting yet in the changes we need to see across every economy in the world. It's not centered around a positive story of incredible opportunities for clean air and jobs and sustainable living and secure supplies of water and food. So that's the job to do.
And from your position of experiencing and visiting many countries in the world to talk about climate change, do you have any examples of effective action from countries or business that have been managing not to, as you said, there are a lot of already carbon locked in from activities from 15, 20 years ago, but what about people that are starting to think in the future and acting now? Do you have any good examples of that?
So there are some incredible examples, mainly I would say from across some of the most poor and vulnerable regions of the world, where they've been already experiencing these issues to the greatest extent and for the longest time, and with very little resource. We've had examples of island states being completely knocked out by the increasingly strong hurricanes and cyclones and pulling together to rebuild. There's the famous example in Bangladesh of the weather event in the last 10 years that devastated the country, but killed a few hundred people. That the same strength of weather event 40 or 50 years ago killed a vast number of people. They've done extraordinary things to bring in early warning systems and more resilient efforts across coastal regions to support their communities with very little money, very little investment. So there's unbelievable resilience and resourcefulness in many of the parts of the world that are affected the most. There's also, I think, extraordinary examples of communities and countries and regions adapting to very, very limited water, to very unsustainable crops, and to again all the impacts that they're experiencing ahead of the developed world. So I think the main message is for some humility and some openness on the part of the major emitters in the big economies of the world, both the wealthy countries and those who've emerged very fast and are still producing a lot of emissions, to look to those examples, particularly in some of the smaller countries, in some of the most vulnerable areas of the world, as to how they are coping, having not been the cause of any of the emissions. I think that's why going ahead and looking at COPs of the future and looking at the wider efforts of the UN and the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks, there's an equal focus on understanding what resilience of sustainable development looks like, to look at the wider sustainable development goals, not just at the climate issue, but all of the issues in an integrated way, and to learn lessons from those who are experiencing it on the front line, and to learn lessons from those who are doing a much better job of stewarding their ecosystems. In the UK, we're making great efforts. We've got some incredible people and institutions, but we've also been degraded our country's biodiversity and ecosystems more than almost any other country on the planet, and we need to look to communities who've done a much better job of stewarding their ecosystems in recent years. So I think there is great hope to be had in looking at those examples, but we have to be, I think, much more focused on getting finance where it needs to go, much more focused on local disintermediated clean energy, looking at the justice of this transition, and looking at a longer term view of what profitability in our corporate sector needs to look like before it's too late.
So Nick, circling back to sustainable finance as you just did, and kind of finishing our conversation here, looking forward, so what do you think the future of sustainable finance will be, and what those companies that do not follow the standards, how do you think they will be either penalized or no? How is the future? What's the direction of travel for sustainable finance and climate change?
Well, I think that most of the incentives are moving in a coordinated direction towards a clean, sustainable investment culture. And what I mean by that is that the clean energy, the clean materials are becoming or are already cheaper, more secure, more local. If you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the desire to get off Russian oil and gas and get into our local renewable energy sectors where it's local and it's secure and it's cheaper and it's cleaner. So there's a very strong economic case for moving to sustainable finance faster. There's then a very strong societal case that supports that. People want clean air. There are all these studies across the cities of the world where we are poisoning our children in their tens of millions through the way that we run our transport systems. And it's crazy. And we all know it's crazy, but it takes time to shift that. So there's all sorts of strong societal reasons. And then there's, on the back of economic and societal reasons, and that's both a return for companies, but also a social license to operate. I think all of this points to us moving in this direction. The problem for me is that everyone has to move. So there's a scale issue, and everyone has to move very quickly. So there's an urgency issue. And we haven't seen that combination of scale and urgency. We can't afford to have any country or business or sector lag behind. We don't have the carbon budget in the world to play with. And so fortunately, when markets move, they can move very, very quickly. If we're wise and sensible about how we set the standards and the regulations and the policies. But in a very contested political and economic world, we have to build up much more pressure for action than we currently have. Hopefully, though, we can demonstrate that it's in everyone's long-term interests, and that we can reset a bit how we pursue our goals in future. And some of those countries that are succeeding can be exemplars. And I think that's a big responsibility in Europe as the founders of the Industrial Revolution and the drivers of the fossil fuel economy. It's our responsibility to make a success of a cleaner pathway and show some humility in how we do that along the way.
Thank you so much, Nick Bridge, and thank you also to Flavia Lima for conducting this conversation. It was a pleasure listening to both of you today and to have you on our show. Thank you so much, and thank you also, obrigado, quem nos ouviu deste lado da coluna, digamos, e esperamos contar com a vossa audiência para a próxima.